Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another Q&A about business and innovation. And looks like we have all kinds of interesting questions here. There's one from Dan or Dane. This is a simple one. I'm going to start with one that's simple. He says, famous last words. How did Champaign, Illinois become the base of operations of our company? Well, our company is about 800 employees roughly. And those 800 people are pretty scattered around the world. So, one of the things that I felt almost a little guilty about with respect to this pandemic is that it really didn't have a big effect on the operations of our company because we have people who worked remotely for close to 30 years now, including myself. But okay, the history of this and sort of a choice of locations question is how did the company wind up being in Champaign? Well, the first company I started when I was working at Caltech in Los Angeles, and that company was in LA, and it was kind of an annoying driving distance from where I lived. It was actually right near the airport, right near LA International Airport, LAX. I noticed the road. Every time I drive into LAX airport, I'll notice the building that we used to have, which had a big sign on it back in the day when the company was there. But that was was my first kind of observation about companies. And in that time, we had some remote employees, mostly salespeople. Didn't work out particularly well. In fact, that aspect of it. Then I went back to being sort of an academic, and I worked at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and it's an interesting but small place, and I was kind of developing this field of complex systems research, and I was kind of wanted to spread wings more broadly than I really could at the institute there, I definitely people there who didn't want me to spread wings, even though the director of the place did. So I kind of decided, okay, I'm going to start some research center for complex systems. And this was in 1985 or so. And I was like, okay, let me do this in an organized way, and went around and talked to lots of universities about, oh, should I do this research center at your university or not? And it was kind of an interesting kind of personality test for universities, because some universities would say things like, oh yeah, if you bring in government funding for what you're doing, absolutely come here. We're thrilled to come and take the overhead on the government funding and so on. Or, well, we'd love to hire you personally, but oh, you want to hire other faculty as well? Oh, no, we don't have slots for those. Or, well, yes, we'd really love to do this, but our bureaucracy is so complicated that it's going to take years to work things through. And you can kind of fill in different universities that were sort of the top universities in the US. I talked to many of them, perhaps even most of them, and it was interesting, very interesting collection of different opportunities and suggestions and so on. But in the end, the university that kind of won that was the University of Illinois, which was both a good university and rather easy to work with, even though it was a little bit complicated because it was a state university, and I was taking the point of view that if I was going to develop technology and so on, that was kind of off limits for what I was doing as a professor, so to speak. And so it was kind of my sort of structure of what I was saying to these universities is, look, I'm coming to start this basic research center and be a professor and so on. I also have this hobby of doing technology and companies and things like that. And that hobby is not what you're hiring me to do. So if you think that's what you're hiring me to do, then don't hire me, so to speak. And in the case of University of Illinois, they took the position that that was merely an interpretation of their normal policies. Whether that's really true or not is an interesting matter for debate. And I spent a certain amount having some intellectual property lawyer, work with them to kind of write something which they took as an interpretation. I said, I don't care if it's an interpretation or not, but it's the document that that I'm using, so to speak. So in any case, ended up in 1986 going to University of Illinois to start the Center for Complex Systems Research and to be a professor in the physics, math, and computer science departments. I'm still a deep adjunct, I would say, professor in those departments, although I will admit that I haven't done too much with them for a very long time. But University of Illinois, I must give it credit for the fact that it did live up to its promises. It's like, we're going to have this number of positions, we're going to have this initial funding, we're going to have this building and so on. This all happened. The only problem was that I quickly realized that I was not a great match for somebody who was running a unit at a university, since my main interests were getting things to happen and doing research myself. And both of these were not really consistent with, oh, you got to fit into this big organization. I don't think I'm a great big organization's cog in the machine type person. I kind of quickly realized when I think one of the defining moments was some meeting to discuss inviting some speaker for some lecture series or something, and it's like, look guys, I came up with this list of people, and they said, no, you don't understand, we got to have this series of 5 meetings to discuss this. And I'm like, no, you don't. You all agree that the people I've suggested are quite sensible, and people, yeah, they're quite sensible. It's like, well, let's just make a decision, move on. It's like, you don't understand. That's not how it works in academia. And it's like, yeah, you're probably right. I don't understand. This is probably not the place for me, type thing. But that was one of the places where I realized that. But in the end, I think we've had a great relationship with the University of Illinois for many years. And I think we were able to bring in some for that Center for Complex Systems Research, bring in some interesting faculty who wouldn't normally have gone there, and I think we were able to start an interesting operation. But I very quickly realized that I personally was not particularly well suited to running such a thing. And so my kind of plan B, I had initially had sort of the plan with this kind of complexity research of kind of crowdsource it, get the world to do this kind of complexity research. I'd started off, now it's time for the world to do its thing. But it turned out to be, and perhaps it's just not my expertise, it turned out to be very difficult to get the world to kind of start its engines and just take it away, do all this stuff. I have to say, we're doing a lot better with the physics project now, 30-something years later. Times have changed, topic is somewhat different and better defined and so on, but that's working much better in terms of, here's this thing, okay, world, now take it away and make exciting things happen with it. But anyway, so I tried to do that with kind of complexity, and my way of making that happen was starting this research center in a journal called Complex Systems, which still exists, and so on. But I quickly realized that this wasn't probably the best picture for me, and so kind of plan B was, okay, I'll start something which can create the tools that I need to be able to do the things that I want to do in terms of research and science, and also a practical company that provides an environment for me to do interesting things that can actually turn into reality in the world, so to speak. And so that's why within a few weeks of actually finally arriving in Champaign, Illinois, as to start the Center for Complex Systems Research, I sort of decided, actually, I'm going to start this company. So it was natural to start it there. Now, I have to say, a year and a half in, we'd started the company, things were up and running. I considered maybe we should move the company somewhere else. And I considered the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, because it's like, well, there's a lot of tech companies there. I had considered back in 1981, I'd actually sort of identified Stanford as a university that seemed like it was in a nice location. And that time it wasn't such a distinguished university. So I considered working there, and they offered me some position, but I didn't completely like it. And it was, I ended up not going there. But I'd always sort of thought, the Bay Area is an interesting place. Of course, the Bay Area has gone through several ups and downs in history. It's well, I don't know whether it's an up or a down right now, but in terms of the number of companies that are there, it certainly is still an up. I think that so I considered probably about 18 months in, I considered maybe I should move the company to the Bay Area. We had few enough employees. It was a realistic thing to consider doing. And so I went out there and I was like, okay, let me check out different areas. I'm kind of telling a funny story here, but I thought, look, the actual San Francisco, well, the peninsula is sort of overcrowded and et cetera, and expensive and so on. The city of San Francisco wasn't really on the map as a tech place yet at that time. And I thought, let's be clever. Let's find a place that's really nearby, but is not as expensive and fancy and so on. So I thought Half Moon Bay, which is on the coast, sort of over from I'm going to get my geography wrong here, but it's kind of over to the Pacific side of the peninsula. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go out there and check it out. And it was, full of pumpkin fields and so on. It was nice and rural, and it was completely overcast and a terrible, dreary day. And I think that's what convinced me that no, this wasn't a good place to move the company. There were other things too, but that was kind of, I considered doing that. I'm really glad I didn't do that, because Champaign, Illinois has been a terrific place to have the headquarters of our company. We've got other operations in different places. And as I say, we've got a lot of people just sort of scattered around the world, including myself. But it really has been a terrific location. Why? Well, it's a nice town where it's not too expensive. As a result of, it's kind of a victim of our own success, so to speak. We may have been a contributor to the economic prosperity of the area, and that's meant that, but it's still the case that, houses are comparatively cheap. People who we pay, somewhat modestly can still afford houses, things like this. It for a long time was pretty close to the median cost of living for the US, whereas, for example, the San Francisco Bay Area is probably 2.5 times, 2 to 2.5 times the median. New York City, maybe 2.5 to 3 times, and so on. So it was kind of an affordable kind of place, but yet a rather international, rather intellectual kind of place because of the fact that there was a large and good university there. And so really, I would say that we, in terms of people coming to the company, we've had a lot of international people for whom it's a good place to come in the US, and a lot of people from the Midwest. People who say that some people who, really love the coasts, and they're always going to live on the coasts, and they consider the center of the country to be, the flyover area, so to speak. And those people won't come to live in that area. I think they're missing things, but that's a different issue. I myself haven't lived in that area for 30 years now for a variety of reasons. I have found, as in terms of my own kind of personal effectiveness, I think being a remote CEO is probably more effective than being a wander around the office CEO. And certainly the culture of our company as a distributed company is one that has lent itself to productivity for everybody, including for me. But I think the other thing that is really has been very nice about Champaign, Illinois, as a location for a company, I would say it has some a good, if I'm to sort of generalize, it has a good work ethic, more so than you find, for example, particularly in something like the Bay Area. A typical model, if you're a company in the Bay Area, is, well, my employees, if they don't like what's going on here, they're just going to go to another company in the same building, or they're just going to go down the street and go sign up for another company. That's not the ethos of what we have in Illinois. There's a decent amount of tech stuff there, but for whatever reason, it's not the kind of the point of view, I think, of people there. There's a slightly longer term viewpoint, at least that's my perception. And it's really been just an excellent place to have as the headquarters of the company, recognizing that there's a lot of geo-distribution of different people who move to different places for whatever reason. So that's the long answer. Somebody's asking, why haven't I lived in Champaign? Originally, because back in 1991, I thought I was going to go off and separate myself a bit from the company to work on a big basic science project. And I moved at that time to California, actually. That year and a half stretched into 10 years. Then I moved back. By that point, I had, my wife wasn't as keen on Champaign as I was, and I also felt that by being not physically at the company every day, I would be able to get more productive things done. And so I ended up moving to the Chicago area, lived there for quite a number of years, and eventually decided kind of we can live anywhere, and where's the place where I kind of know more people than anywhere else. And the winner of that was the Boston area. Number 2 was San Francisco for me. Number 3 was London. So I've lived in the Boston area now for, 19 years now. So let's see. All right, questions, more pragmatic business questions. And I see a lot of these, but question from Smishy here. Is it a doable thing to work at a university and run a startup at the same time? Don't know. People seem to do it a bunch now. When I started doing it back in 1981, it was sort of not a known thing, and there was a lot of tension around it. I would say that it really depends on how enlightened or not a university is. It really depends on how serious or not a startup you have. It depends on how central a person you are to that startup. One of the things I found interesting over time is there was a time when people would say, you're going to be a CEO. There's no way you're going to be a CEO of more than one company. It's just crazy to think about being a CEO of more than one company. Just don't even think about it. And then, Steve Jobs kind of did that between Pixar and Next. And then, people have done it. I don't know, Elon Musk does it between, several companies, SpaceX and Tesla and so on. It's really kind of interesting that that's become a thing that people consider to be, okay, yeah, you can do that. I think, I mean, we have multiple companies because of different kinds of things we do. And yes, I'm the CEO of multiple of these. And yes, it is a doable thing. Now, between academia and and companies, I think the thing to understand is there are different goals of doing a startup and being in academia. And if you want to spend some of your time, writing papers, supervising students, teaching classes, and some of your time trying to build products and trying to do the kinds of things that are typical in a startup, then that's fine. But if you try and mix those two together, I suspect it's a formula for trouble. I mean, I think that the whole, let me get my students to work on my startup, I don't know, that tends to lead to all kinds of trouble. I mean, it may be done with the best of intentions and even the best of results for some students, but I think it's something which has to be done with some care, or you end up with all kinds of weird and crazy situations of, am I going to have my vice president of whatever, am I going to pass them in their qualifying exam or not? These things will get too weird too quickly. I think that in terms of when you do in the startup phase of a startup, there is a time when it is, I've never seen it not be really quite intense. And to go and show up and teach a class you've been teaching for years yeah, okay, you can probably do that. To really dig in and be intense about what you're doing at the university, probably not. I mean, when I started our company, I was a professor at University of Illinois, and it was a little bit bizarre because I was working on both the technical side of our company and a bunch of the business side of our company. And I was like, okay, I'm going to make it back from my trip to Silicon Valley or something just in time for my class about whatever else. And it was a little bit of just a weird thing. It felt a bit Indiana Jones-like, as in, you're teaching the archaeology class and then you're going kind of into action, the next day type thing. And it was a little bit strange because I was teaching at some point a class about computation and things, and people were asking me all these things about different computer companies and all this kind of thing. And I think at some point they kind of realized that, yeah, I was actually involved in this industry. And so then they started asking for stock tips and so on, which was kind of fun. But I just thought it was a strange clash of worlds, which I don't think was completely supportable in the end. And I have to say, okay, I will have to tell a story here. The very end of my time as a professor, I had been teaching a class about physics for non-scientists, which I thought would be a lot more fun than it actually turned out probably to be. But at the end of that class, I was just before, just before version 1, maybe even, right before version 1 of Mathematica was released. And there had been some news articles about our work. And there was one that I think had a headline. It was in like Forbes or Fortune or something. It had a headline saying something like "Physics whiz goes into biz." It had some picture of me eating an ice cream, I think. But in any case, that article had just come out. I decided at the end of this class that I was teaching, I decided to have a kind of an ending party for the students who'd come to this class. So I have this party. It wasn't a very successful party. The students didn't really say very much, but somebody who was working with me at the time decided, okay, just to liven things up, they would make a bunch of copies of this article that just come out like that day or something, and just bring it in and hand it out to the students. So they did that, and the students go around and they're reading this article, and eventually one guy who is sort of the typical fraternity pattern person with the baseball hat on backwards and things. I don't know whether they still do that, but was kind of says to me, looks up, says to me, "Hey, with all this stuff going on out there, what on earth are you doing teaching college?" So I was like, yeah, this is probably the last time I'm going to do this. Anyway, I have to say, I've actually heard from some students who were in that class that I taught many years later, and that's been very nice. But in any case, all right, let's go back to okay. There's some much more practical questions here, and I want to address some of them. Well, there's one. Okay, one from Praveen. At a pre-revenue stage, should a company aim for reaching revenue faster at the expense of cash, or saving cash in order to survive a little longer at the expense of time and market opportunity? Well, gosh, I mean, that depends so much on what you're doing, where the cash is coming from, why you need the cash, all those kinds of things. One point is, what is the time frame that you're aiming for when you start a company? Is this something you're going to do for the rest of your life? Or do you want to be, or are you already a serial entrepreneur where at some point you're going to say, I've done 7 companies? Which of those models are you adopting? If you're going for the serial entrepreneur mode and you're kind of like 5 years per company, that's, there's one set of optimizations. If you're like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, it's a different set of optimizations. I think that in the this is the 5-year plan, I think sort of timing of opportunities and so on, that's the critical thing. I mean, you know, if you're doing an NFT startup, do it now, so to speak. Don't wait 2 years and then do it. I think that you know, there are things where there's sort of a tide that happens in the world of things where, yes, if this is going to be a sort of standard startup, it's like, yes, the venture capitalists are going to be excited about that right now. Employees are going to be excited about that now. Customers are going to be looking for it, et cetera. Now sometimes a little bit of a weird thing, because sometimes the hype in the world is way ahead of the customers that exist. I mean, there are plenty of areas, whether it's, you know, XR kinds of things or IoT kinds of things, or even blockchain kinds of things, although that worked differently. It had its own different dynamic because of ICOs, where sort of the hype is significantly ahead of the customers and the real revenue. And in, you know, so kind of if you're in a business where that's happening, it's like, yes, you can raise money, but it's really hard to make money because there just aren't yet customers, or the whole ecosystem is not developed to the point where there are. And so sometimes, you know, there are companies where their biggest skill is raising money, and they'll raise more and more and more rounds of money. And that's what they're effectively doing. What do they make? They make stock that they sell to people. I mean, that's a little bit of a cynical thing to say, but I think that's been a pattern. It's even been a pattern with tech companies that have gotten very big. I think the model, which is not really favored in the tech industry, it's certainly not among investors in the tech industry, is let's go and make money by making money. Let's go and actually sell stuff to people and bring in revenue and make money kind of the old-fashioned way. I mean, for most tech companies that are sort of investor funded, it's very much the model of, you know, shovel in investor money, you know, work very hard, make lots of noise, and we'll, you know, if we've built up enough visibility, enough kind of eyeballs or something, then revenue will follow later. Different model. So I think the question of whether you kind of burn down cash to generate revenue, I mean, that's a detailed question that depends on what your investor pipeline looks like and so on. I mean, sometimes, okay, so here's an example of something people do. It's like, okay, you've got this thing, and can you sort of spend money to make money by selling it, so to speak? You've got a thing, and left to its own devices, if you just put it up on websites, you did the obvious social media stuff, nobody's yet going to buy it. It's going to be a slow ramp that might take a couple of years. But by sort of spending enough money, by putting enough ads in front of people, by having, you know, commission sales folk and so on, be on the phone selling things, then yes, you can make money by spending money. You know, does it work to do that? My observation is I've seen a bunch of companies fail trying to do that, because what happens is you can essentially buy sales by these kinds of devices. You can just get, you know, by the time you've called enough people, some of them are going to buy something, but it's awfully expensive to call all those people. And the margins are negative typically in doing that. And so, you know, I personally think that strategy, you know, it may be something that looks good for some investor purpose. It seems like a mistake to me to kind of, you know, to just buy sales in that kind of way. I think the most extreme case was a company that was at one time a wannabe competitor of ours a very long time ago, eventually went public in a disastrous IPO. But anyway, one of the things that they did, I think, is they decided that they really wanted to buy sales. And so they essentially bought a 5 million piece direct mail mailing. And they sent it all out. I think I got like 30 copies of that mailing. So somebody was kind of cheating them a bit in terms of the actual mailing list and so on. But what they ended up doing was they ended up, how did it exactly work? I think they also had resellers. And somehow they ended up bringing in revenue, making money by selling their product for whatever it was, $400 to people. But actually, oh, that's right. They were selling it to resellers. And the resellers were paying them a certain amount of money, but they were providing marketing incentives to those resellers that were at least equal to, if not more than, the actual price that they were selling the product to those resellers for. Probably not really an okay accounting practice. Don't know if it wasn't at the time, but I don't think it would be now. But so in other words, they were essentially buying sales by literally, you sell it to a reseller and then you pay the reseller more than you sold it to them for. So, it looks, you book that as revenue. It says, it looks like the reseller bought it from me, but well, yeah, there aren't any profits because I spent all this money on marketing. That marketing was sort of a co-op marketing expense, but you actually paid it to the reseller. Probably a very fishy thing to do in these times. So there's a question here from Mitchell. How do you deal with employees who may be very talented and productive, but may find it hard to fit in with the rest of the team? I wonder if it's even possible for large companies to be agile in this respect. I think our company does particularly well at having a real diversity of characters and personalities able to work at the company. I mean, I sometimes am, as a manager of people, it's, I would say, I like people enough that I am amused by the major foibles of some of our employees, probably including myself. I think it's really a question, I suppose, of, well, it's partly a question of corporate attitude. What really matters is being productive, and the place where you have to plug in to the company culture is you got to make something that we can actually, fits into what we make as a company. It might be different if what we made was, I don't know, consulting was primarily, let's say, different kinds of consulting services where the different things people deliver might be very dependent on their personality. For us, the things people deliver sort of have to fit into the main thing we're building, even also at the level of services we provide. But the ways that people actually do that work can be widely different. And I think it's a question of sort of a management sort of approach that says it doesn't matter that these people are kind of funky and some are very argumentative and some are very kind of overly agreeable. Some don't ask for help as much as they should. Some waste a lot of time because they're always asking for help. Some, are, incendiary in working with other people, things like this. I would say that, yes, there is some kind of management skill required to kind of, interact with those different kinds of people. I mean, I find for myself that the times of interactions that I will have with people are sometimes very different depending on personality. I mean, there'll be people where I've worked with them for decades and I've never had an aggressive conversation with them. And there are other people where I've also worked with them for a long time and where I regularly have incredibly aggressive conversations with them. And, but both sides kind of understand that's just the means of communication, so to speak. And it's, I think that being able to deal with those different sort of forms of communication is necessary for this. Can that work in large companies? I don't know. I think that there are probably, I think it depends on kind of the management structure and how siloed things are. And there may very well be parts of those silos that are very, that work differently from other parts. I don't know. I think that, it follows the general principle of, when you have a company, at least like ours, you have a certain set of people, a certain set of kind of talents, and you have a certain set of projects. And kind of a large part of the role of management is to match those two things up in a sensible way. I mean, I think that there are certainly times in the history of our company where there will be sort of fights of some email kind, let's say, between employees. And then it is, again, the role of management to kind of try and calm those down. I have to say there are cases where there have been very, personal attack type things between people. And my general observation is if there are two people who get into sort of a major attack fest, it's often because they didn't have enough else to do. And it's a sad but true fact, both people will be gone within 6 months for one reason or another. Not because we let them go, but just because they just won't fit in anymore, and it won't continue. And I think that's but yeah, I mean that's again, I don't know what fraction of how many times a year I end up having to do this, but it's not very many anymore. But you know, people will just get so upset with somebody. Now, as far as I'm concerned, people getting upset about something to do with what the company does is not necessarily bad, because it means they care, which, as far as I'm concerned, is really important. I mean, if somebody says we're doing the wrong thing, it's, you know, we should be doing it this way. We've got, you know, we picked the wrong technology. We've done the wrong thing. You know, we're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not emphasizing this enough. And they get very worked up about that. And maybe they have some terrible fight with somebody else about that. Well, you know, I'm really glad they care. I'm really glad everybody cares. And then let's try and sort of unpack the issue and see if we can understand how to make peace, so to speak. And usually that's not terribly difficult. Sometimes people, one of the things that can happen is people can be batting back and forth in email, and they'll sound very, very aggressive in email. And I'll have to tell, you know, both people, just pick up the frigging phone and talk to each other. And they'll say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we resolved it. You know, he's a perfectly reasonable person. Yeah, you know, I got the wrong idea by just seeing these pieces of email. Yeah, that's been a thing that happens. There's a question here. How do you plan a roadmap for our company? Does it just happen naturally, or is there deep thought into what you do to make it happen? Well, I think there's several levels of that. In terms of the overall, what is the point? What is the vision? Where are we generally trying to go? Absolutely spend a bunch of time thinking about that, and definitely have an overall vision, and have had a very consistent vision now for more than 30 years for our company. Then in terms of how, you know, do we set a plan? Okay, let's lock in for the next 2 years, we're doing this. We really don't do as much of that. And the reason is because it's really hard to predict. When you're doing something that's never been done before, it turns out you might get it done in 6 months. It might take 4 years. If we say we've got this plan and we're sticking to it, and it's going to be a 2-year plan, it's like, well, golly, what happens if it doesn't work in 2 years? You know, you can't make the impossible possible. It's just so I don't tend to make those kinds of very rigid plans. Another thing I've noticed is when you say, I found it quite often the case that when you imagine a new product, it's like write the marketing page for that product, write a draft of the marketing page, because then you know what you're talking about that product. Then you actually go build it. By the way, that's similar to in designing Wolfram language. From the very beginning, I was very much a write the documentation first as you're going to explain it to users, and then actually build it. But when you go and actually build it, whether it's a product or some piece of functionality in the language, sometimes when you actually use it, it doesn't feel like what you thought it was going to feel like. You realize, well, actually, that wasn't quite the right direction. That's not really the important thing. And so then you have to go back and sort of reorient the way that you're communicating what's going on. And for me, sometimes it's like, well, let's plan the marketing of this, you know, plan how we explain it, and we'll plan it months and months in advance. It's usually a mistake, because it's only when the thing is really finished that you really know what you have. And then you can kind of go and explain it in the best possible way, rather than, well, this is what I thought was going to be important, but once I actually get to use it, I realize actually this other thing is important. So my attitude towards that, which sometimes drives people crazy, but is kind of just wait until almost the last minute to do the final kind of presentation of what it is that one has. Even though at the very beginning, one sort of thought, this is the direction we're going in. This is what I think we're going to be able to say about this. Then you actually build it, then you see what you have. Now, in terms of how one structures some kind of actual projects that go on, that's complicated. And in our company, we have a pretty good infrastructure of project management, which is something that we've had for probably 25 years now. The thing that has been a challenge for us is, and people would joke about it for a long time, is, can you make a list of all the projects that are going on at the company? Okay, well, there was a time when various people had tried to make lists and the number of projects was larger than the number of employees. Okay, so that's kind of a bad sign. So finally now we actually do have good lists. So what are the challenges in making that lists? So we have a list of probably a couple of hundred projects that are sort of in various stages, and I'll explain the stages. So the way we do it is I should explain, one of the issues in making such a list is, what is a project? Like, what is something that should be considered a project? It's not add this little line to a website. That becomes something in our project tracking system, low-level project tracking system, but it's not a strategic level project. And so there's sort of a question, what's a project? There's a question of what's a project and what's a process? Like continually expanding the Wolfram Challenges website, let's say, that's a process. The building of the website in the first place is a project. So what we are these days doing is, it's a project at the beginning, and then it becomes a process where every month, every 3 months, whatever it is, something happens with it, or even every day people are doing something with it. But it's something where it's a different thing. There's no new thing that has to be conceptualized. It's a thing that's going to keep going. So in terms of projects, what we tend to do is we'll have a list of potential projects. Then we have various kinds of project review meetings in which projects go in several directions. One possibility is that a project is under investigation. It's like, can we really do this? Does it really make sense? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's work to be done in the investigation phase. Then the next thing is, okay, we know we want to do it. It makes sense. We have some sense of the resources that are going to be needed. Then we say the project is green lighted. Okay, so then, but we haven't actually allocated resources, and maybe the key people who are going to do that project are off doing another project. So that project can't be started, but it's green lighted, as in we know we want to do that project. And then then there's a question of where we find the resources. In some cases, that has to be queued up behind some other project because it has to wait for that project to finish, and so on, because the resources overlap. And eventually the project is underway. Once it's underway, it has a definite structure of having reviews and things like this until it gets to be finished. And then we got various other states to do with what it means to be finished. Another thing that can happen is the project gets to be under investigation, and it's like, nah, not now. Doesn't make sense to do this project now. So then we have another category, which is hibernated, which is we will store everything we know about this project, but we're not going to do it yet. And this project is something that it's been important to us that we've hibernated projects sometimes for years, many years, and then we bring them back to life. We still have all the material from when it was previously figured out. It's important to the teams that work on these projects that, okay, your project, you got a certain distance with it, but we decided it just wasn't the right project for right now. It's going to be hibernated. That doesn't mean it's going to be killed. In fact, very few projects that ever got onto the kind of green lighted list in the company, I'm trying to think of ones which have actually been killed. I can't think of any that have actually been outright killed. They've been at most hibernated. Now, whether they will ever recover from hibernation, we don't yet know because it hasn't happened yet, but it's my expectation that all of them will at some point. So that's kind of the approach. Now, another thing we do is we have these kind of strategic bundles, which are kind of collections of things that fit together for some overall objective, and projects aren't strategic bundles. Strategic bundles are separately conceptualized and then have to be connected to projects. So there might be some bundle that's about, I don't know, expanding into emerging fields, or there might be one about dealing with existing customers, or there might be one about dealing with research organizations or something. These are much more general issues than the specifics of, okay, we're going to build, we're going to build a big computational chemistry system, or we're going to, do more serious work in some direction in machine learning or something. So that's kind of a different process run in a different way with sort of crosstalk to the actual projects that get made. And by the way, the projects I'm describing, these kind of big strategic projects, as I say, each one of those projects, once it's actually underway, gets some, I don't know, I'm not so deeply involved in these pieces of the project management system, but the term gets ticketed is a pretty common one. And I have to say, I'm sometimes like ticketed and towed and so on, like with cars parked in bad places or whatever. But it's like, it means it's turning into a series of hundreds of specific tasks that will be ticketed in the internal project tracking system, so that they can then be actually done by people, and where we can watch the progress and confirm that things have been done and so on. So let's see. Okay, there's a question from Harry here about what's the experience with management paradigms like Scrum and Agile? Can I recommend a general strategy? I'm always, so some people in our company have used some of those methods for a short while. As far as I'm concerned, different people running groups, as far as it's like being able to deal with different kinds of talents in the company. It's groups that work in different ways. Fine. If the group produces what it should produce, I don't really care what the internal mechanism of whether they're doing, stand-up meetings for 5 minutes in the morning, or whether they're doing things where people check in every 2 weeks, or whether they're doing, this or that or the other. It doesn't really make any difference. And it's really up to the individual managers of those groups what they do. In terms of the company as a whole, I would say that no, those methods we haven't. I mean, I think maybe some of what we do might be described as related to Agile, but I think the official set of kind of, you do this and you do this and you do this, we don't follow those things. And I'm sure there are systems where you do this on a yellow piece of paper and this one on a green piece of paper and so on. We don't follow those kinds of things. I think that there are pieces of what we do that are a bit unusual but interesting. I mean, one of the things that I kind of do, and lots of our other managers do as well, is kind of the think in public type mechanism, where you're doing working meetings with people. I'm even outrageous enough to live stream a bunch of these working meetings where we're actually trying to figure things out in sort of in real time, where it isn't like, oh, everybody's going to go off and do their homework and then come back with an answer. It's like, look, we've got all the basic sort of stuff we need to make a decision. We've got that kind of lined up, but the actual making of the decision, we're going to just do that as an interactive thing in this kind of live working session. And the same is true, like, okay, we got to write some key piece of text on some website. It's like, okay, let's just do it. There are 5 people relevant, 10 people relevant, whatever, let's just do it. And we're just going to do it sort of in this kind of live session, rather than let's delegate it to so-and-so who's going to hide away and do this and then come back with something, and then we'll go through an approval process and so on. It's rather, let's just sit down and do it. And that's been a kind of an extreme version of some of these kind of agile methods, I suppose, to be able to do these kinds of things. And I think it's very, very productive thing. I think that the thinking in public mechanism is, it's very educational for people. It's also educational for the person doing it, but it's educational for the people who are watching it done, because they get to learn how to figure those kinds of things out for themselves. They get to make contributions to what's going on. One gets kind of instant consensus about things, and one doesn't have people saying, oh, I don't know why it was decided that way, and so on. And so I think it's a great process. It requires a certain amount of sort of quick thinking, and it requires a certain amount of I would say, confidence on the part of people doing it, of like, oh my gosh, this could go horribly wrong. And yeah, it could go horribly wrong. And with some fraction of the time, it does go horribly wrong, but that's okay. It's still a very productive thing. Let's see. There's a question here. Okay, it's a question from Praveen. Would I elaborate on the distributed nature of our company? Well, I don't know. There's a picture on the website that gets updated from time to time that has little pins for where we have employees around the world. I think an important thing is that we started doing this 30 years ago, and when the tools were not nearly as good as they are today, we generally didn't use video at all. In fact, before this pandemic, we had video capabilities for our sort of web conference meetings for 20-something years, and I basically never used it. And the reason we didn't use it is because I always felt that we were doing these meetings and the focus was whatever document or something we were working on and people interacting with that. And sometimes I would have 20 people in a meeting and I fully wanted only 5 of them to be paying attention at any given time, because the other people were there because sometimes we might need to know something. And if we have to go find people, that's a big kind of drain on the effort. Now, actually now, with everybody being remote, one of the things that's been quite useful is we often have meetings where we'll have, 5 people there and 10 people on call. And that means that somebody will, there'll be some, chat session that we have, and it's like somebody will either somebody who's a project manager who's in the meeting, or somebody who is dealing with logistics who can be reached through the chat sessions. Like, can you go and get so and so and have them join this meeting? And I suspect they go and use chat and go and ask that person to join the meeting, and then that person knows they're on call, so they're expected to actually be available for that period of an hour or something, but they're not actually in the meeting. But in the past, particularly, and even now, it's like you can have a bunch of people in the meeting and they don't all have to be paying close attention. And that actually is a good thing because they can be working on something different at the same time. But then it's like if an issue comes up that is, their issue, it's like, okay, so-and-so, and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Okay, fine, it's good. But the time it takes to repeat 1 or 2 sentences to bring them up to speed on the question you wanted to ask is very short compared to the, oh, let's schedule another meeting when so-and-so can attend it. So that's a productive kind of thing. Now, during this sort of pandemic period, I would say a few more meetings have had video, and not many that I've been involved in, but some people, some managers at the company really like using video for their meetings, and that's fine. I think I've noticed maybe it's an improvement in video quality, maybe it's changing expectations and so on, but I found some of those, particularly for one-on-one discussions, more useful than I had in the past. But I think so we have a number of actual offices in different places around the world, including in some in a variety of countries, both sort of the obvious ones and not so obvious ones. It's been very nice in some places where we have offices in the not so obvious kinds of places, that it's sort of big fish in small pond type thing, and that's a really good situation. And a little bit like we have in the case of Champaign, Illinois, where it's not, we're not in a sense competing for talent with the very biggest fishes, so to speak. We're a big fish ourselves, and that's worked really well. I would say that some people and some managers find it much better to have people concentrated in an office, and others have no problem having people be sort of completely remote. We usually start off, at least in pre-pandemic times, we would start off by having any given person initially be at an office for a month or 2, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, to kind of get enculturated into the company culture, and then they go remote. That's been a more successful thing to have happen. Now sometimes, for example, we have our summer school every year, and we often get particularly technical employees who've been at our summer school, and that's been sort of 3 weeks of, usually, except when there's a pandemic, on kind of in-person interaction. And so that's something that kind of is sometimes a proxy for people being physically at an office for some period of time. So that's another approach. It's a question from KitKat. Should there be a limit on the maximum number of people in a project or in a meeting? Well, I get kind of frustrated when there are more than 20 people in meetings, not because I think the meeting's going to crash and burn, but because I'm just thinking, how much are we spending on this meeting? Have all these people here? Now, if I really am convinced that many of those people are sort of, successfully not paying attention, then whatever. I think in-person meetings are very different. We, honestly, I do so few in-person meetings with our company every year that I barely know the answer to this. It's always very strange when I go to like our company headquarters. Particularly, we typically have an annual technology conference, which is a good excuse for many of our particularly technical staff to come physically to be in the office together. It's often, I would say, more of a social event than it is a productive event, although I know some teams run kind of retreats at that time, talking about what their sort of strategic directions are for the next few years. And I think that I know in at least one team's case that's worked really well. I think so. In terms of projects, one important thing about projects is somebody has to be in charge. If there's nobody in charge of a project, it's probably doomed. If it's like, well, there's 3 people in charge, it's like, that's probably not a good sign. So, it's important to have a person in charge. Now, sometimes, a project might have some people who are sort of actively architecting it. Then there'll be people who are dealing with, I don't know, some aspect of localization to different languages, or graphic design, or writing this piece of code, or doing testing, or something like that. And it's kind of scale invariant, the size of the project, just like companies. By the time you have layers of things getting done, the layers where, okay, there's people, somebody's going to test this. Okay, there may be 5 people involved in testing, but only one person needs to be the representative of the testing group when there's a sort of strategic discussion about that project. So to the people who are looking at the strategy of that project, just looks like, well, it's just one person doing testing. Well, it isn't really. There's other people who are actually doing the work there, but the interface, the sort of the API for that component is just one person, so to speak. So, I mean, in terms of a project, I mean, there of course are, look, the most important thing on projects is to have the right people working on them. You have the wrong people working on them, they can just spin for years. The right people working on them, they'll magically get done. Sometimes there's questions of if a project is in bad shape, if it has been spinning for years, or it has been like, why isn't this done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you layer in a new set of people? Can you do that? Do you say, okay, we're just going to change the set of people? There are a variety of kinds of fancy footwork that have to be done to take a project that has been floundering and kind of bring life to it. And sometimes I've seen it work. You just bring in one good leader type person, and the people who are there, who are already in the project, are like, okay, great. Now we know what to do. Now we have a direction. We can go off and execute well. And sometimes you have to kind of go deeper, and you have to basically say, look, this project is going to get moved to a different team. I would say that's the minority case, but it certainly, I've seen that happen. And sometimes, one of the frustrating things when a project is floundering is, why is it floundering? Can you dig deep enough to find out why it is floundering, or why something isn't happening? Why is this project 6 months late? Well, maybe because the wrong people are working on it, maybe because it's harder than you think. The most likely reason is because they're doing the wrong project. As in, you thought, it was, we're going to build, we have an intention to build this thing, But then it turns out, as you get into building it, you realize, wow, there's this piece of that project that's really, really hard. But we had this plan. We're going to build this thing. It's got 5 components. One of them is really, really hard. We got to build the whole thing. We're going to build all those 5 components, including the one that's really, really hard. Well, that's probably not the right thing to do. Probably the right thing to do is to zoom out a bit, think about what is the overall strategy of this project, and say, can we get around that really hard component? Do we really need that really hard component? Or is there a way of achieving the sort of strategic objectives of that project without having to bash your head against that particular really hard component? Now, one reason that gets difficult from a management point of view is once the project is underway, it's under steam, it's got a team working on it, that team are the ones really thinking about it. And there's no point at which it goes back. That team will just say, we're going to get it done. We're going to take that hill. We're going to do it. And they don't come back and say, turns out that hill is a lot harder to take than we thought. What should we do? That, unfortunately, that's a process that is hard often to extract, because people are like, no, we really can do it. And so that's, we try to have kind of enough kind of senior level project reviews, at least with some frequency, that you can kind of detect those issues. And usually what happens when I'm involved in these things, it's like, I have to have a sense, how difficult should this project be? I mean, if people are just saying, if I just say, well, why isn't this project done? And it's, look, it's a 6-month project, sorry, it's going to take 6 months to do it, then it's silly for me just to say, why isn't it done every 2 weeks? But on the other hand, I have to have a good enough idea of how difficult the project is that I can tell if something has gone very wrong. If the thing that should have been a few-week thing turns out to be a many-month thing. And sometimes that's a really difficult thing to figure out. You have to drill a long way, and you have to have really pretty good understanding. I mean, particularly with technical projects, I obviously I'm a very techie guy. And so for me, kind of CEOing the techie sides of our company is, in a sense, is not so difficult, because with these projects, in principle, I can dive in, drill down, get down to the show me the code type stage. I kind of feel for people who are non-technical CEOs of companies that have a lot of technology in them, because they can't do that. Although I would claim that when people say to me, oh, I'm a poor non-technical CEO, I can't understand things. My point of view is, actually, you can understand it. You might not be able to write the code, but you can understand the strategy of what's going on. I've seen that over and over again in our company. For example, a lot of project managers that we bring in do not have particularly technical backgrounds. But the thing that I always kind of get a warm, fuzzy feeling when I see this is somebody who has a pretty non-technical background, but they're very organized and so on, a good sort of raw material for project management. There comes a point where they understand this project at the strategic level better than the technical people who are actually implementing the project. So although they might not be able to write a single line of code for the project, they know what all the functional components are and how they all fit together, and what the kind of technologies are going to be used for this or that piece better than technical people. And that's always a good thing. And I do think of that when non-technical CEOs say, oh, I can't do that. My CTO says this, and et cetera, and I just don't understand, and so on and so on and so on. But when projects get into trouble, the ability to really dive down and see the details is pretty important. And sometimes I would say, even in our company, with the age it is, and the fact that I've been CEOing for, well, a long time, 35 years now, it's still the intensity of drilling sometimes necessary to find problems with projects amazes me. I mean, it is, people sometimes with the best of intentions will just say, oh, no, don't worry about that. You don't have to look at that part. It's all going okay. It'll be done next week. It'll, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you really, really drill, you sometimes find, oh my gosh, I just found this lump of stuff here. You guys have been trying to drill through, you've been trying to get through this lump of stuff. That's why your project is 5 months late, because there's this lump of difficult stuff and you haven't figured out a way around it. And oh, well, if I'm feeling on top of things, maybe I can figure something out. But at least I might have a more strategic, kind of more zoomed out view of what the point of the project was, and might be able to say, well, actually, we can avoid doing that part and kind of reroute the road so we don't have to go through that difficult part. So I think that's an important piece to this. I think, okay, there's a question here from Seema. Is there a suitable period of time one must devote to reading about previous innovations and developments related to the theme of a project before actually jumping into the implementation? Interesting question. I mean, I find you can end up doing tons of book work, and then your brain is kind of sort of oriented only towards what people have done before, and then you completely can't see new things to do. That's a bad situation to be in. So, but on the other hand, to just sort of blithely go forward and say, I'm going to do this, and I don't know anything that anybody's been done before, that's a mistake. That's silly. That's not leveraging what people have figured out or whatever else. So my approach tends to be, I kind of conceptualize some project that I want to do. I maybe try and read sort of the obvious things about it and the things that I can understand. Then there's a whole bunch of stuff I can't understand because I don't know all the details. I haven't thought about the area well enough. Then I typically start actually doing the thing myself, or we start looking at it, talking about it, whatever else. And as we do that, we understand more about what kind of the contours of this problem actually are. And then after I've kind of understood more or less how to do it or how I think it should be done, and I come up with some hypothesis, oh, we should do this, whatever else. Then once you understand it for yourself, then you can go and see, okay, what did other people do for this project? And then you're much better equipped to say, there's this whole set of things and that whole set of things. You know, something happened to me just a week ago. So I've been working on natural language understanding and these kinds of things for many, many years. And I've been working on things about kind of formal computational systems for many, many years. Well, there's this particular area of that's sort of a merger of formal systems and semantics, language understanding, these kinds of things. It's a thing that emerged in the early 1970s. Doesn't really matter what the details of it are here. But anyway, I'd sort of looked at it a bunch of times. I'd never really had done much for me. I didn't really see what the point was, and so on and so on and so on. And then I was looking at it again, and it's like, because I think I really understand all the pieces that are around it, and I felt like I was about to reinvent the thing. And so I went and really looked at it in detail, and it's like, oh my gosh, these guys just went off in the wrong direction. This was a bad idea. And, you know, however many hundreds of academic papers and so on, and some products actually too. And it's like, I am pretty sure at this point, I'm really quite certain this was just a bad idea. I don't have to look at it. You know, let's see if there's any detritus, so to speak, left over that's worth looking at. But the fundamental thing was just a bad idea. It's not going to work. But I would never have gotten to the point where I can pretty confidently say this is a bad idea, you know, without all of the development of having understood all this stuff myself. Sometimes this, yeah. So I mean, I think that the most, you know, when you solve problems, one of the things I've noticed is, you know, sort of head for the center of difficulty. Don't kind of try and walk around the edges and say, oh, the big problem is way too difficult. We can't deal with that. Let's just try and sort of, you know, poke at it from the corners, so to speak. And let's try and take the roads that people have already taken that get somewhere near the center of difficulty, but they're not that close, but we'll take the roads that people have already taken. My observation is what usually works best, both in technology and in science, is figure out what really is the center of difficulty, what really is the key problem, and try and define that as well as you can for yourself, and then say, okay, well, maybe that problem I can't solve, but I can, with some method that I know or whatever else, I can solve this problem that achieves a large fraction of what needs to be achieved for that sort of most difficult part of the thing. And that's taking a different road. It's not taking one of the roads where somebody's already got some distance towards that kind of center of difficulty. It's just saying, let me take what I know, from the outside and try and sort of parachute in and find how close I can get to the sort of center of difficulty rather than taking one of the existing roads. I found that's a really good approach. And it's like, you know what you know, you have a certain set of things you know, you have a certain set of methods you know. You may not know those kind of roads that take you some distance in towards that sort of center of difficulty, that you would have to learn those. But you do know a bunch of methods that you know. So an obvious thing to do is identify what the center of difficulty is, try to understand that well, and then say, given the methods that you know, can I beat my own way through the jungle, so to speak, to get there, perhaps in a different way than people have done before. So that's always been a quite successful thing for me. Okay, a couple more questions, and then I should wrap up for today. Okay, so Praveen asks, is it possible or practical to avoid mid-level managers while scaling up the company by creating sub-founders who work just like the founder at the founding stage of the company? Well, okay, so one thing to understand about companies is companies are imprinted by their founders. And, you know, try as you might to make a company that does not somehow map into sort of the contours of your own personality, it's probably not going to work. And, you know, that constrains the type of people who are likely to be successful working with you because they have to sort of map into that same sort of personality pattern. And it constrains kind of how sort of the overall culture of the company is going to be a projection of some kind of the founder typically. And so I think this question of, do you have people who kind of work like the founder? Well, yes, with the same sort of, I would say, you know, sort of corporate cultural values or something, the same kind of approach to things. Yes, I mean, you know, I like to have a diversity of specific approaches, but in terms of the general, we're going to make great products and we're going to spend a bunch of intellectual effort doing it, and so on and so on and so on. Those things are part of at least our company culture and are very much sort of a thing that you'll see throughout the company. So I think in terms of the sort of the mid-level managers, so one point I might make about sort of the mid-level manager situation is, you know, in our company, I think it's fair to say that everybody actually does stuff. There's basically nobody who is just a manager. You know, people are doing things and then supervising. Maybe they have other people who either work with them or are advised by them and managed by them, who are doing, you know, doing sort of extending what can get done. But, you know, there's some companies, I think, where there's particular level of middle management, which is neither involved in overall strategy, nor involved in actually sort of quotes doing the on the ground work, but is mostly involved in sort of the sort of the connecting the dots type thing. And in our company, we really don't have, I'm trying to think, I don't think we have much of that at all. I mean, we have project managers, but that's different. Those are people whose job is to make sure that all the pieces of the project get connected together correctly. They're not the people who are doing personnel management of the people working on that project. The sort of personnel management tends to get done more by this sort of guru type people who are themselves working on actual content, rather than the people who are making the mechanics of the projects work well. You know, both the roles, but they're different roles and they don't have to be packaged together. And I think for our company, you know, a sort of cultural aspect of our company is that people all do things. There aren't people who are just managing. And I tend to think that the just managing kind of mode of work is, I think other companies I know have sort of tried to reduce the ranks of the just managing folk, because it's, well, I think it's more satisfying for people to feel like I produced something, I made something, I created something. Most people like that. I mean, they can make a plan for a project, things like that. That's fine. That's making something. But the just sort of telling other people what to do kind of thing is you know, it's I don't know, somehow I think it's nice for people to actually feel like they've made something and or figured something out or whatever else, rather than that they're just a cog in a machine that's sort of just providing sort of transmission of mechanical work or something to another part of the machine. I think so. You know, I guess can everybody think really like the founder? There are a number of paradoxes to that. One paradox that's bitten me a lot is, you know, at this point, I'm pretty experienced. And so there's sort of this challenge of, you know, there are things where I'll know exactly what to do. And there won't be, you know, I just have much more experience in a bunch of things than other people might have. And so it's inevitable that I can do it faster. And then the question is, so when should I do it? And when should it be delegated to somebody else to do? And, you know, when do you get in this, you know, if everybody was like the founder, so to speak, of the company, then, you know, that's sort of paradoxical because the founder probably started first and they'll kind of build up more experience. And so there won't be that kind of equality. I think for me, for example, in our company, you know, I would say, don't, you know, some companies, okay, so there are companies where everybody thinks they're a founder, so to speak, and there is a very kind of, oh, what can I say, sort of a founder prima donna type thing going on. And some companies have a lot of trouble with that. You know, particularly in Silicon Valley, there's lots of kind of, you know, people who are just, you know, the sort of a big part of management is just keeping all these big personalities at bay. I think we have plenty of big personalities in our company, but somehow they don't have quite the same manifestation of sort of they'll have opinions about their domain, they'll have things, but it won't be sort of the same kind of, I want to be the top dog of everything all the time. I mean, there's you know, if you have a company that has leadership, there's going to be the top leaders and there's going to be the not top leaders. And I think that's that's something that you know, people, if you say, well, everybody's going to be a top leader, well, I mean, you can do that to some extent with title inflation. You can call everybody a president if you want to, just like there was a trend for calling everybody a vice president a while ago, but that doesn't really get you anywhere. I think it's you know, you have to recognize that there's going to be sort of a top leadership and there's going to be people who are working, you know, following the vision of the top leadership. If everybody thinks they have their own separate vision, just like the top leadership does, that's probably not going to work well. I mean, sometimes I've told people who work for our company, you will never be happy working for somebody else. You've just got to start your own company. Other times it's like, fantastic, you're really entrepreneurial. Hey, here's this business unit, go run this business unit. And you're largely, you know, you're only loosely coupled to other things that are going on. I would say that another feature of companies like ours, for example, is, you know, how do you sort of promote talent, so to speak? I mean, we've been very fortunate that we have just a wonderful flow of new talent into our company, often quite young people. And it's, for me, it's kind of, you know, when do the 20-something-year-olds get to take over the company type thing? It's interesting to see to what extent that's a thing. And for us, the sort of bizarre thing, because the company's been around a while, is that a lot of people we're hiring who, you know, were born after our company was founded, after our product was launched, all those kinds of things, and sometimes who've known about, you know, our stuff since they were really quite young. And that's kind of an interesting dynamic in terms of sort of sustaining a culture for a company. All right, let's see. There's a question here. What are the most tiresome things in your job as a CEO? You know, for me, I like creating stuff. I kind of was projecting that onto everybody else a moment ago in terms of what people sort of want to do, but I like building stuff. When I'm doing things where I feel like I'm making something, I'm making a piece of a product, I'm building up I'm figuring out how to get a project done, I'm figuring out some strategy, I'm creating something. Those are satisfying things for me to do. Even sometimes when I'm helping a person to, you know, when I'm talking them off a ledge and getting them to see that this is a good direction for them, those all feel like they're productive things. They make me sort of feel like I'm spending my time in a worthwhile way. I would say one of the things that you know, often CEOs of companies like mine, you know, it's common for the CEO to be very involved in kind of the front lines of selling things. I made the decision when I started our company just not to do that. It's like, okay, we might sell more if I was the main pitch person, so to speak, and the main person closing the deals and so on. But I just don't want to spend my life doing this. And I'm going to bring in people who I think can do it well, and I'm going to step back from that. And part of the reason I don't personally like that is because it feels much less productive. You're trying to make a deal, there's some counterparty, the counterparty, it's like, I know what the deal should be. It's like, look, I can see what your company should be doing. I can see how what you're doing should fit in with what we're doing. There's a real win on both sides. But, the other side is like, oh, well, we can't, I don't understand, we can't do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For me, that's a frustrating situation because I feel like, I could spend a lot of effort, like, let me explain it to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other side is like, well, we decided to budget something different this quarter. Sorry. It's like, okay, then that's all wasted. There are other people who have a different approach to the things they're doing who find it very interesting to kind of do this kind of, more sports-like kind of activity of, can we make this work? Can we close this deal? Can we do this kind of thing? Not my kind of thing. I don't really like that. I would say that certainly some of the infrastructure operations of our company, like IT systems and things like that, I have been, they're not my, we've actually been rebuilding our whole ERP system to use our own technology. It's going to be very beautiful, and probably we'll sell it to other people too. It'll be a very nice new generation of that type of thing. We finally did that after many years of kind of struggling with sort of other software for enterprise software for doing that. And part of the reason perhaps we were struggling as much as we were is that I'd never really paid attention to that stuff, how the transaction processing works and all that kind of thing. I suppose in a sense you could tag me as a slightly, I don't know whether you'd say irresponsible CEO or something, but there are things I just don't pay that much attention to. And where, the trick is really the things you don't pay that much attention to, are they going to hum along okay? If they are, it's a big win to not pay attention because then you have that time to spend on something else. And then the trick is to know that thing that looks minor, is it going to blow up into a big mess that you're going to have to waste a lot of time on? That's an important thing to be able to identify if you can. And the thing about a company like ours, and a general advice about companies, is there are things we do that we're really pretty unique at doing. A bunch of technology development, a bunch of content development, a bunch of vision and so on. We're really pretty unique at those kinds of things. We're not unique when it comes to, I don't know, dealing with renting office buildings or something. We're not unique when it comes to the way that, our payroll system works or whatever. So, and we're not unique when it comes to some other kinds of things. And so in a sense, it's like, what stuff are you really going to pay is really kind of CEO driven. It's very, very unique. And what stuff do you get people who know how to do that stuff really well? And it's just like, just do what you normally do to do this, because it's going to be fine for us, because we're not really any different from other companies in that regard. And sometimes I see people, who say they're going to start this company and they're going to do everything themselves. Sometimes they're going to say, I'm going to do nothing myself. I'm going to contract out everything. I'm going to have that, but both ends are a mistake. I mean, in our company, we have contracted out very little. In terms of, to outside companies and so on, we have our own in-house, graphic design, legal, this, that, and the other, all these kinds of things. That's been a huge win. The main reason why that can be a problem, let's say you're doing graphic design. We have a pretty large graphic design team. And, one of the things that could happen is that you say, well, our work is lumpy, like, oh, we'll have, this big product we're building and there'll be nothing for them to do for 6 months. Turns out this just doesn't happen. By the time the company is above some scale, or if you manage things properly, it just doesn't happen. But the advantage to having an in-house, let's say, graphic design team is those people, they really understand what we're doing. And they, and they can, it's not just, oh, let's make this thing pretty. It's like, let's actually make suggestions and lay it out and suggest this doesn't make sense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's something where you really get a lot more value out of having a team. And, in our graphic design team, I think most of the people know Wolfram language. I know the person who leads that team is a very good Wolfram language programmer, even though his background is pure graphic design. I think, you know, these are things which you get if you sort of integrate like that. But so, you know, I would say that my strategy as a CEO is, if it's tiresome to me, delegate it. I think the other point to realize is, typically, if it's tiresome to me, it's something I'm probably not going to do that well. Now, you know, occasionally there are things like some big sort of kerfluffle with people where it's like, oh gosh, do I really have to deal with this? These people are acting incredibly childish or whatever else. It so happens that I'm interested enough in people that I don't really resent that much. It's just like, okay, let me chalk it up to another funky thing that I've had to deal with, and I learn a little bit more about the human condition or something, and I learn yet another weird thing that can happen that I've never seen happen before. Okay, so I think last question for today from Jim. Perhaps it's opportune. How do you stay so intense and focused after all these years when you could have retired much earlier? What on earth would I do if I retired? It would be deadly. I think people often say retirement is the most dangerous. You know, if you sort of rank risks at a medical level, retirement is the most dangerous thing you can do. No, but seriously, why do I do what I do? Because I like doing it. Because it's now, you know, having said that, I have been very fortunate in that, you know, I've sort of built this platform for doing things, but the specific things that I'm doing have changed over time. So, you know, I spent a bunch of time over this last year working on fundamental physics, very much using the platform that we've already built, and now very much feeding back from those ideas about fundamental physics into extremely practical things that we're doing with distributed computing and a bunch of other areas. I think somebody had asked about practical applications of the physics project. Yes, there are some quite wonderful ones. They're not about physics. They're about things like understanding distributed computing, understanding things about blockchain, understanding a bunch of different areas, understanding things about actually new ways to think about program execution and so on. These are things that have come out of the conceptual framework of the physics project that I never would have guessed would have come out of there. But it kind of follows the thing that I've done in my life, which is this kind of oscillation back and forth between basic science and technology. And often I can't predict, you know, I'll do a bunch of technology build out, then that will allow me to do some basic science. Then it turns out that basic science will have feedback for more technology. And often I can't see past those barriers. I couldn't, if you'd asked me, is the physics project going to be useful for anything? I would have said, I don't know. I don't think so particularly. But it's turning out it's super, super useful. And even, you know, a new method for solving partial differential equations that is coming out of it. Just a whole bunch of things that I never would have guessed would be come out of the sort of paradigm that we built for the physics project is informing a lot of other kinds of things. But so why do I stay sort of intense and focused? Because I really like what I'm doing. And part of the reason I like what I'm doing is because we're always, you know, I feel like I'm building this tower and it's really fun because I built a new floor to the tower. I can see a bunch further. Oh, look at that really cool thing off in the distance. You know, we can go get that one too. And then we can, you know, incorporate that on the tower, build even higher and see even further. And it's really fun. And, you know, to me, it's very satisfying that the things I've done over the last probably 40 years altogether have really been, I would say, very successfully building on each other. It's not like I can say, well, I did that in the past, that's gone, now I'm doing something different. It didn't really matter I did that thing in the past, I could have done the thing I'm doing now anyway. For me, it's very satisfying. I don't know, I'm sure it's different for different people, that, you know, I can really build this tower. It's like I'm looking back at things I did in 1980 and I'm realizing, gosh, that was interesting and that contributes a brick in this tower that I'm now able to produce today. Now, having said that, there are a few times in my life where I felt like, okay, I did this thing, I tied it in a bow, it's finished, now I can go on to the next thing. For me, that thing that's tied in a bow and finished has ended up being a brick that I can build on top of, but I can see that it can be satisfying just to, tie it up in a bow, finish it, send it off. It's done. But I think, so I would say that the number one reason for staying intense and focused is because I like what I'm doing. And I think that that's partly a question of the environment that I built in terms of the company and so on. And there's just a lot of people I enjoy working with associated with that. I find it sort of satisfying that I can take ideas that I have and can turn them into real things. There's a mechanism for turning them into real things. That to me is very satisfying. I would say that that's what I would say about that. Now, it's like, if I were to retire, what would I do? The thing that's funny is that in my life, I've sort of alternated between doing science and doing technology. I've also alternated between doing the thing that was my day job and then doing a hobby, so to speak. And I have to say that essentially every one of my hobbies has turned into a real thing in the end. And, I could have said, well, I was doing science, but I was doing business as a hobby, and then start companies, and then I'm doing companies and I'm doing science as a hobby, and then that turns into big projects and so on. And so it's a thing where there's sort of this whenever I'd say, gosh, let me just go and have fun. Let me start a hobby. Well, pretty soon that turns into a real thing. I would say that, it's advice to other people. I mean, if there's a thing you really like doing, it's like, just do some of it, because you'll be very productive there, probably much more productive than things where you're like, I don't really like doing this. I will say another thing about sort of the rhythm of things that I do is there are times when I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm still doing this. For example, when it comes to explaining some of our technology to people, it's like, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody asked what I don't like to do. Here's an example of something. It's like, I've been telling people the same thing for 30 years. When are they going to get it? That's frustrating for me. And sometimes I think, that's probably the crisp answer to what's the number one thing I don't like doing, that I actually end up doing is like, explain the same things to people. It's like, I've written the same thing. I'm not going to write it again. And I've realized from a bunch of things I've done, particularly with the physics project, that sometimes there are things that one does that if one didn't do them oneself, it will be a really long time before they got done. I mean, I think the physics project, maybe 50 years, I don't know. I mean, maybe there are things where people are kind of lapping at the edges and they would have done it. I don't think so. I think it's one of these things where, because of a weird set of coincidences and circumstances and so on, it was like right place, right ideas, ability to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we get the project done. And same is true with a bunch of technology we built. It's kind of we built it. And because we could at this time, we built this tower that allows us to build a bunch of things that are not, where mostly there's no, there's the big tower, and then there's not much around it. And we've been just building and building and building this tower taller and taller and taller. And the question is, when's the city going to arrive? And, I think that period of time may be very long. And that's one of the challenges, right now I sort of talk about it as artifacts from the future. People who are using our technology, they do things where they show it to their colleagues and it's like, oh my gosh, I imagined one day you'd be able to do that, but that looks like an artifact from the future. And it's like, that's the stuff we're producing. And there's a question of sort of how do you communicate artifacts to the future? If the city already existed around our tower, it will be a lot easier, but it's kind of a tower that's somewhat out in the wilderness where you can, if people who climb up the tower, they can see a long way and do all kinds of cool things. But there are a lot of other people who are like, tower? I don't understand any of that. And that can get, but it's something where, for me, the fact that the things I've done, as I've tried to build this over the last 40 years, the fact that there's sort of, one can see the things that one has done in the past that now contribute to what one has today, that's to me, a very satisfying thing. And I was addressing what would I do if I were retired. And I don't know, I've been sort of saving up some things. It's like, well, if I wasn't doing this, I might do that. I would say that there's a whole lot of writing of things and explaining of things that I feel like I should do. And I'm going to start a big project on one of those things very soon, which you might view as it's a retirement from some of the things I've been doing right now, although I'll end up going on doing those too. So anyway, I should, having talked about retirement, I see I've got only a few minutes before I'm jumping into a piece of day job work of a design review. I don't know what it's about, of something. I think it's about visualization functions for Wolfram language. So which will be live streaming, so you can check out the day job if you'd like to. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And our schedule of these live streams is, I should say, please follow us and so on. For people who are actually in motion being entrepreneurs, we have a program called our Eureka program, which is kind of a program for getting people really involved with things that we're doing. I just mentioned that. I would say logistically, our live stream kind of thing is on Fridays. I'm doing science and technology Q&A for kids and others. And then every other week, I'm doing a business and innovation Q&A like this one. And in the off weeks, I'm doing a Q&A about history of science and technology. So anyway, thanks for joining us.